Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I go back to some of my really old reviews and bring them more up to my current quality standards. This time we're taking a look at Battlefield 1942 along with both of its expansion packs, which are The Road to Rome and Secret Weapons of World War II, all of which were released for PC and Mac. This is a first-person shooter that was released in September of 2002 for PC and later saw a Mac release in 2004, with both of the expansions being released in 2003. Now, before we get into the review proper, I do have to mention that this game has aged extremely poorly. It just doesn't function properly on modern systems, whether that be because of the resolution options in-game being limited to 4x3 resolutions, which means that the maximum resolution is 1280 by 960, although you can bring that up by going into the config file and messing around with it, which is exactly what I did, so that's why you're seeing 1080p here. It's because I actually had to go and edit the config files for that. Same thing goes for fixing the FOV, because the FOV is designed for a 4x3 resolution, and it really doesn't like that when you try to mess with it. So you end up having to go to another config file and editing that so you can actually get a somewhat acceptable FOV for a widescreen resolution, which is of course a pain. And even then, the menus still run at 800 by 600, and when you try to exit the game, it will keep your monitor's resolution at 800 by 600, and then you have to manually switch that as well. At least that's the version I have, which is the Battlefield 1942 Complete Collection version, which is my old retail copy that I've had for years and years and years at this point. Of course, that doesn't really matter all that much considering that this game is no longer available digitally, which means you have to track down a physical copy. You see, in addition to incompatibility issues with modern systems, it also had one really nasty thing happen to it, which was the closure of GameSpy. GameSpy was what they had their server browser through, and this extended on up through Battlefield 2142, I believe. So you can't play multiplayer anymore without additional game tools like Game Ranger or something like that. And so EA made the decision to pull it from Origin, which means you just can't get it anymore on digital platforms. Which is a bit of a shame because it's just nice to have an archival copy. But anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the actual game. It is, like I said, a first-person shooter that was released in 2002, and it was a pretty big deal at its time, and the Battlefield series obviously has gone on to become a blockbuster AAA title. But back when it was first released, we hadn't really seen anything quite like it before. It had a huge amount of players. You could have up to 64 players on the map. Holy crap, that was insane. Of course, that does come at a price, which I will of course talk about in a moment. But suffice to say, the reception at the time was pretty fantastic. People generally enjoyed the living hell out of it. It got quite a few awards, and it of course went on to become a huge series. But let's go ahead and take a look back at it and find out what it's really like. Obviously, in the visual department, it really hasn't aged well at all. You got a lot of really low-res textures, the environments are rather sparse for the most part. While they might have buildings or they might have rocks or trees, generally speaking, there's really not a huge amount of detail in them. And when you get to the actual weapon models and animations and such, they end up looking incredibly clunky. The weapon animations in particular just drive me up the wall. For example, when you use a bolt-action rifle, you fire the rifle, it has a ridiculously over-exaggerated recoil animation, and then you just bring the rifle down and you jiggle it around a bit while you hear the bolt cycling sound, and then you just bring the rifle back up. It looks absurd. And the animations in general are often rather awkward and really not at all accurate to the way that these weapons actually work in real life. And that's when they're being accurate at all. For example, the Japanese get a semi-automatic rifle when they didn't really field any of those, while the Americans, who should be using M1 Garands because that was the entirety of frontline soldiers in World War II, end up actually using Lee Enfields of all things. And it's just kind of baffling with these various issues. I mean, the Japanese get a lot of German weapons. It's just weird. And that doesn't really improve when you get to the expansion packs either. They introduce a few new maps for the Secret Weapons of World War II that are still in the same fronts that you see the war in normally. It's just that they introduce some new content to those. And then there's the Road to Rome expansion, which introduces the entire Italy campaign, and once again, everything is rather wildly inaccurate with it. And of course, it's kind of funny. People tend to consider the Battlefield games to be more realistic than Call of Duty, when that really hasn't been the case until you get to Battlefield 3 and 4. But I digress. Obviously, to the modern eye, the visuals look absolutely terrible, but even back in the day, this really didn't look all that great, and it ran like complete garbage. Both because the average system of the time wasn't really capable of running this thing on the highest settings, and because this game is janky as hell in the technical department. Random slowdowns, crashes, all sorts of weird glitches abound in this thing. And while certain engine oddities, like when an enemy gets hit with a explosive of some sort, they go flying off in a pre-rendered animation that is basically just meant to be them falling on the ground, but they just go flying, they can bounce off of the environment. It looks completely ridiculous, and often it's actually pretty amusing. But again, it's just a side effect of the way this engine is programmed, and it really does seem like the engine is held together with duct tape and a few nails here and there, and those bindings are really coming loose now that this thing is well past its prime. And so you end up with visuals that are rather poor, even for the time they didn't look that great, and the engine itself is just a buggy mess. Similar issues abound for the sound design, which is kind of interesting because DICE has become associated with the absolute best as far as sound design goes, particularly with the sounds of warfare with their more recent titles. It wasn't really until more recently that started happening though, because frankly this game sounds like garbage. With the exception of the sniper rifles and tanks and such like that, the weapon sounds in this game are downright pathetic and extremely unrealistic. And that's when they actually work. You see, there's this really nasty glitch that this thing has that they never fixed and was present back in the day as well, where your sound will just cut out entirely for no discernible reason. Not that it really matters all that much when the sounds of warfare in this game are so, frankly, primitive, but it's still rather irritating nonetheless. The other aspects of the sound design have their own issues as well. The soundtrack itself is actually fairly good. It stands out amongst a crowd, and that's mostly because there's barely any music in this game. And when you do hear it, it's basically the main menu theme or the Battlefield 1942 theme, which has become rather iconic. And that's pretty much it. But then there's the voice acting. You have the option of either playing this with everybody speaking English, only when you're playing as, for example, the Germans, it will be German accented English instead of just straight up English. Or you can stick with the default, which is to just have every single faction speaking its own language, and thus the battle chatter ends up being fairly accurate to what's going on, except for the simple fact that the voice acting in this game is pretty bad. But it's bad in the amusing way, where it's just kind of over the top and ridiculous. I mean, you've got the American voices being like, "We're taking casualties!" And all the German voices sound rather stereotypical, things like that just kind of give the game a weird sense of charm, despite the voice acting itself actually being pretty crap. So at least it has that going for it, and at least it has the Battlefield 1942 theme going for it, even if it doesn't have the visuals or the sound effects themselves going for anything. But of course, what really matters here is the gameplay, because there's really no story in this thing. It's World War II, and that's pretty much all you need to know about it. They do have a campaign mode available, but it's basically just going through various battles with the AI, so it's really no different than just going into an instant battle and just choosing the map. The difference, of course, being that you don't have control over which map you're going into next. So really the campaign is kind of worthless, really. You'd just be better served by doing the instant battle feature. And this was one of the earlier multiplayer only games that kind of did something like that, where it didn't really have much in the way of a single player, and that's become kind of a hot button issue these days, with such games as the reboot of Star Wars Battlefront and Rainbow Six Siege being extremely light on the offline content, and in the case of Battlefront being extremely light on content in general. But really, it's nothing all that new. This trend goes back to the very late 90s, early 2000s, and it's only more recently that it's become a particularly big issue, and that's in no small part due to the fact that these older games tended to have a lot of bang for your buck when they did have some limited single-player content. Such is the case with Battlefield 1942. It is primarily a multiplayer game, and for its time it boasted something that was incredibly impressive. 64 players on one server with combined arms warfare in gigantic maps. That was a big deal when this thing came out, with the only other shooter doing something similar that I can think of being World War II Online, which I'd never played back in the day. I was just aware of it. Although that's really a completely different scale from Battlefield 1942. That's a straight up MMO FPS. And that's something to keep in mind as well. The early 2000s were the era when we were really starting to get good at making 3D games, and thus you ended up with a lot of experimentation, Battlefield 1942 being one of the more successful examples of that. Because, let's face it, can you name all that many other games that actually have 64 players on a single server? Not that many. Most of it is just Battlefield or the older Star Wars Battlefront games, and maybe some games support 64 players, but they aren't really made for it at all, and so basically nobody plays them as 64 players, i.e. Call of Duty 4, which you could actually get 64 player servers on, but it just doesn't work very well. So particularly for 2002, this thing was a huge leap forward in terms of technology, except for the fact that this thing is as ridiculously janky and buggy and broken as it is an impressive technical achievement. As I mentioned before, it is plagued by bugs and glitches up the wazoo, and particularly on modern systems, it crashes a lot and has a lot of other issues. And that's all on top of the multiplayer service being terminated. So I'm going to try to convey to you what the experience is like at its best and what it's like right now. When it comes to the actual core gameplay, you play as one of 5 classes. You are either a scout, assault, medic, anti-tank, or engineer. Each of which has, of course, different weapons as well as different special items. For example, the engineer gets a wrench that they can use to repair vehicles. They also get landmines and some TNT. The anti-tank gets, as their primary weapon, a rocket launcher of some kind that is used to take out enemy vehicles. The medic gets a medic kit where they can go up to a friendly character or use it on themselves to heal. The assault class is just a straight up damage class. They get a machine gun or an assault rifle basically as their primary weapon. So they exist purely to go in and wreck things. And then there's the scout, which gets a sniper rifle, and that's really the majority of its use. People just use it to snipe things because you can also use that class to actually spot for artillery, but people didn't really use it all that much. Some of the weapons actually do have some sort of ballistics attached to them, namely the rocket launchers that you get. For example, if you go and fire your bazooka at an enemy tank, then you're going to have to actually adjust for the projectile drop, and it can actually get very significant even at a pretty short range. So that is something you're going to have to learn to do. And you're also going to need to learn to actually lead your targets because the hitboxes can be pretty wonky in this thing, and that's when there's no lag, let alone when there is lag. But other than that, you're going to be using only the crosshair, and your zoom factor will just be zooming in for a better view of what you're actually shooting at with your crosshair. And you're going to need to learn to control your bursts, because with the fully automatic weapons, they can get ridiculously inaccurate ridiculously quickly. And they're really not all that accurate to begin with, so it can get pretty frustrating when you basically have to empty your magazine to hit somebody. But after a while, you kind of get how each of the weapon classes handle, because between the various factions, there's really not all that much variety with how the weapons actually handle. To give you an example, the Germans get the STG-44 assault rifle as their weapon for the assault class, where the Americans get the BAR. And while the BAR gets 10 less rounds than the STG-44, it handles pretty much the same. I mean, it seems to do a bit more damage, but it's kind of hard to quantify that in game terms because the game doesn't tell you anything. But that's the thing, it's not just about the infantry combat, because if it were just about the infantry combat, then it would be an extremely pitiful first-person shooter. Frankly, the FPS mechanics in this are very primitive and really quite terrible when you get down to it. So it's a good thing that that only falls into a part of the overall whole, because you also have this combined arms gameplay that comes along to try to save the day. This means you can get into a lot of different kinds of vehicles. You can get into tanks, you can get into APCs, although they weren't really APCs back then. You can get into, for example, the Secret Weapons of World War II expansion, you can get into jets. And in the rest of the game, you can get into normal airplanes like the Mustang and such. So it definitely does a lot to really give you this grand sense of warfare where you're pushing up with your infantry buddies along with your tank support, and you all go up over a hill and you're coming down upon an enemy-controlled point. And they've got their own tanks, or they've got air support, or they've got some various artillery pieces set up, and a big firefight ensues. That stuff is actually pretty cool when it happens. But the problem is twofold. The first is that requires a lot of teamwork to really get the most out of, and with the AI being as absolutely atrocious as it is, I mean, everything you're seeing in this video is on the absolute highest difficulty setting with regards to the AI. They are ridiculously dumb. So in the single player, you're definitely not going to be seeing all that much teamwork, but when you got online back in its heyday, it was pretty impressive to look at. But that doesn't really mitigate the second problem. The second problem being that there is a very delicate balance with regards to the classes. The anti-tank class has only anti-tank weapons. They have a pistol, and then they have their rocket launcher, so effectively they only have an anti-tank weapon. Their pistol is really only useful at really close ranges. And so you have to have support for those anti-tank rolls, and when the enemy is really pushing you with a lot of tanks and such, it can become a really big pain to deal with unless you have your own tank units or you have a lot of anti-tank guys. And with the way this is set up, it is extremely easy to mow down a huge amount of enemies. With tank-on-tank battle, for example, it's really just a matter of who hits first and who is the more accurate shot. But infantry battles are complete chaos. People dying left, right, and center, grenades flying all over the place, bullets flying everywhere. It is complete chaos, a complete mess of a game. And when it comes to the airplanes, good luck, because the controls really aren't that great, so it takes a huge amount of practice to actually get remotely decent with the various airplanes, and particularly if you're playing Secret Weapons of World War II, the jets. So expect a lot of the pilots to just be flying around like complete lunatics and not really getting all that much accomplished, because they're trying to dogfight and fighting the controls at the same time. So if you get somebody who's really good, you can get some pretty cool air combat going. But if it's just an average player, then it ends up being a complete mess. And that's just this game in a nutshell. It tends to devolve into complete chaos at one particular point in the map, and you have both teams just smashing against each other until finally one of them runs out of spawn tickets. Now you can somewhat mitigate that by having human players, but it only goes so far because that's basically what the core gameplay is. You go to the various points on the map, you try to capture them in order to reduce the enemy's spawn ticket counter to 0, and the more points you control, the faster that goes. If you have more points than them, their ticket meter will go down. If you have equal, then nothing will happen, and if they have more than you, your spawn ticket counter will go down. And of course, every single time you spawn, you take up a spawn ticket. And with 64 players, the 300-ish tickets that this thing is set up for actually go down really quickly. And there's a lot of things that newer players are going to take for granted here. There is no unlock system in this game at all. Everything is available to you right from the start. It even tells you how many people are in a specific class right on the menu for when you're spawning, so you can plan accordingly. If your team has too many anti-tanks, you can pick a scout, or you can pick an engineer, or something like that, to fill in a role that your team needs. And this is a completely different mentality from the current Battlefield mentality, where you do have some people doing things like that, but most people just pick whatever they're most comfortable playing and roll with it. In this game, it really does encourage you to try every single role and fill in where you are needed, as opposed to just picking one thing and sticking with it, unless you just really excel at that particular role, in which case, go for it. But modern Battlefield is really not about that anymore. It is a wildly unbalanced mess, whereas Battlefield 1942 had a actually surprisingly good balance between the infantry and the vehicles. You couldn't just take a single tank and lay waste to the entire enemy team all in one go. The maps are simply too big for that, there's too many spawn points, their player count is way too high for that, and there's way too many vehicles on the map to actually be able to do something like that. So you had to actually work together with the vehicle support in order to actually be able to do anything in this. And again, that is not what modern Battlefield is. Modern Battlefield is dominated by tanks and helicopters, and the infantry combat itself has effectively devolved into Call of Duty at this point. But here's the thing, it's not so much that this game is wildly different from the current Battlefield era. It's that it has aged about as well as a festering wound. I mean, as I've mentioned before, the thing barely even works anymore. It barely worked to begin with, but we put up with it back then because it was just kind of crazy to be able to play 64 players on a map. And in that era where the technology was rapidly advancing, we were very easily impressed with things. So it's really only in retrospect that you understand just how crappy Battlefield 1942 really is. Sure, it laid the foundation for what eventually would be basically perfected with Battlefield 2. But when you get down to it, it's an incredibly crude game. The FPS combat is just downright awful. Moving around on foot is extremely slow. You just take absolutely forever to get anywhere on the map because the maps are gigantic in this. Some of the maps are just straight up unbalanced because they start off with the enemy team actually controlling all of the points on the map, and so the other team has to actually go in and capture all of those points already at a disadvantage. The vehicles handle like complete garbage. I mean, the tanks just take absolutely forever to get anywhere, which is pretty much what you would expect, but they don't really handle rough terrain very well either. And so when you manage to get yourself stuck, it can get pretty irritating, and trying to aim is also kind of a pain with tanks. Flying a plane basically does nothing for your team unless you're flying one of the ones that actually has the troop transport capability, because then you can fly it over the enemy's points and actually have everybody drop out and parachute in. Oh, and fun fact about that, the parachute key is 9, so if you were wondering why you kept plummeting to the ground and dying horribly, that's why. The single-player AI is downright horrible, so you really do need to play this thing online for maximum effect, and now that GameSpy has been shut down, you basically can't play it online anymore without having to resort to external methods. So really the game is plagued by way too many problems to actually save it. And when you look at the expansion packs, when you really get down to it, you only get a couple of new weapons, which are throwing knives, the shotgun, and the semi-automatic sniper rifle that the Germans can get. But those are only available in the Secret Weapons of World War II maps, and only some of them, in fact. And while both Road to Rome and Secret Weapons of World War II give you quite a lot of new maps to run around in, it's only Secret Weapons of World War II that really shakes things up quite a bit by giving you the addition of jets and motorcycles and such like that. Although I do have to admit the jetpack is also pretty amusing in Secret Weapons, but other than that, the expansions don't really add all that much. They're really more map packs than anything else, and while that is definitely appreciated, they didn't really justify the price at the time, and when you look back on them, they're really just basically skin packs and with a few extra vehicles and some new maps to mess around with. So they don't really justify the rather expensive price tags they had when they came out. And even more irritating, you can only play one expansion at a time. You can't play, for example, Secret Weapons of World War II, which was the second expansion, and have all of the content from both Road to Rome and Battlefield 1942 available to you all at once. Instead, you can only have the Secret Weapons content and the Battlefield 1942 content, or you can only have the Road to Rome stuff and the Battlefield 1942 stuff, and there's no way to merge the two expansions, which is just kind of baffling, frankly. But even with the extra content, Battlefield 1942 is not able to escape the fact that it has aged about as well as a festering wound. And with that age comes the sobering realization that the majority of the reason we actually like Battlefield 1942 is nostalgia. It was one of the earliest games to be at least somewhat successful in this sort of combined arms approach on a really big map. And it definitely deserves praise for that, but when you get down to it, the game just isn't very good. In fact, once that nostalgic haze wears off, you realize that the game is actually pretty bad. And this becomes particularly apparent if you have played Battlefield 2, which basically takes everything that Battlefield 1942 and, of course, Battlefield Vietnam did, and actually does them well. But that's a review for another time. As far as Battlefield 1942 and its expansions go, I hate to say it, but it's ultimately a bad game, and thus I'm giving it a 1.5 out of 5. As I mentioned, it established the formula that would later be basically perfected with Battlefield 2, and it definitely deserves praise for that. It also deserves praise for being a pretty significant technical achievement at the time. But unfortunately, the game just has so many glaring problems that is not enough to save it, and the nostalgia factor is certainly not enough to save it either. Thanks for watching.